Hi folks, today we're going to be discussing the Buddha and politics using this new book out by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Okay, I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And we'll be discussing today the Buddha and politics and society. And we'll be using this book, which is a relatively new book out by Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's a collection of suttas from the Nikayas, that is the earliest group of Buddhist discourses that we have. He's selected the ones that he thinks are most relevant to this topic. Although I will say that there are some that aren't in here, but that I think are also relevant. But still, this is a very good collection. Bhikkhu Bodhi is a Western American monk who is probably the leading translator of this early material. And his translations are generally very, very good, very readable. This book was apparently compiled in 2011 in the aftermath of the Sri Lanka conflict that ended in 2009. Apparently, a group of people wanted a collection of material from these early texts to give to Buddhist monks and Buddhists in Sri Lanka to help them reconcile with each other after that long conflict. It was then used, this material was then used, apparently being used now in Burma for the same end, to try to bring the Burmese people back together in harmony, using some of these early texts as material to learn from. This material comes from early Buddhism. The Buddha himself lived around between the dates 480 to 400 BCE. He lived around 80 years. And he lived in a society that's really quite different from the one that we have now. A society of small kingships, of groups of powerful people who ruled areas together as confederations as well. That seems to have been the area that the Buddha grew up in. So the general impact of these writings that Bhikkhu Bodhi talks about in this book involve what are mostly material on the individual level, so the psychological level, personal training. He begins with issues of understanding the difference between skillful and unskillful action, skillful and unskillful speech, understanding that anger and greed are a problem, understanding there are things that we can do to overcome states of anger and greed, such as loving kindness practice. Bhikkhu Bodhi in this book, I think, which is very nice, notes that it doesn't seem from the Buddha's discussion of these issues that one had to believe in rebirth. Now, there are some suttas in the Nikayas where the Buddha does argue that rebirth is necessary. Certainly it's part of what is considered traditional right view. However, as Bhikkhu Bodhi notes in this book, there are other passages in which the Buddha does have discussions with people who are non-Buddhist, lay people, who do not believe in rebirth, or at least who are agnostic about rebirth, and the Buddha is willing to have a discussion with them and make them understand that even in that case, even in the case where we are not reborn, nevertheless, one has to understand there are things that one can do skillfully and unskillfully, that one can cause other people harm, which is not to one's own benefit, or one can cause other people to have benefits, which, again, comes back to one in a positive fashion. So there are a number of different subjects that Bhikkhu Bodhi chooses in this book. He goes over issues of anger, how we can deal with anger, issues of right speech and wrong speech, and how we can speak in ways that are more helpful to us and more helpful to society at large, issues of how to be a good friend to one another, how to be helpful to one another. Now, these are all, when I discuss the issue of politics, of course, in a sense, all politics comes down to issues like these. Comes down to issues of personal psychology. Comes down to issues of how you deal with your neighbors. But let's leave that aside for now and come back to it at the end. He then goes on to issues of larger groups of people. In particular, as we might expect from his context, the Buddha discusses the monastery, how monastic individuals, monks and nuns, can live in harmony in communities. What he calls intentional communities, that is, communities that are intentionally created by their members for a particular end, rather than natural communities that we live in, let's say, an urban or a suburban setting, where we don't choose our neighbors, where we're not choosing to live there because of a particular end that we're seeking. In monasteries, they are, and so disputes in a monastic context are particularly likely because the monks are together a lot. Whereas you may not see your neighbor necessarily very much, monks would generally, and nuns would generally, end up seeing each other quite a bit. So the realm of disputes becomes larger, and the problems with disputes become larger. The Buddha spends a lot of time dealing with the problems of disputes, trying to argue that disputes are both unnecessary and, in a certain sense, unwelcome, giving us ways to approach disagreements with others so that they don't become disputes. Teachings of patience in particular. And these are, again, like the previous ones, issues of interpersonal psychology, of your close relationships to friends, to equivalent of co-workers. One might even use some of this advice in a working context. The last of the particular issues that Bhikkhu Bodhi talks about in this book have to do with society and community, and those are perhaps the most relevant to politics, or what we consider politics today. This begins with, again, personal issues, parents, how you deal with your parents, how husbands and wives deal with each other properly, how one can structure a household so that it is to the most benefit to the people who live in it, balancing income to expenditures, for instance. These are relatively straightforward kinds of advice that I think we can all agree with. Importantly, he deals with caste in several very strong passages. As many of us may know, the Buddha was opposed to the caste system in India, believed that it was basically a fiction. The caste system in India stated that there was a distinction in a certain sense, value between the Brahmins at the high end, the Kshatriyas, or the royalty, the Vaishyas, traders, and the Shudras, who were the laborers. There is actually, interestingly enough, in many of these early texts, the higher two levels are switched. The Kshatriyas are actually on top, and the Brahmins are second. And there's some debate in academia as to whether that indicates that Brahmanism hadn't quite invaded or extended to this area of India, and the Buddha, being in a Kshatriya, in a royal kind of lineage, may have considered his lineage actually higher than the Brahmin. But nevertheless, these were considered to be issues of birth. They were one was a Brahmin by birth, one was a Kshatriya by birth. One could not change that. And the Buddha argued that these castes were simply humanly created fictions. And instead, the Buddha suggested human value depended upon one's ethical conduct within life. So he argued for a Brahmanism of ethics, if you like. The true Brahmins for the Buddha were the people who behaved without greed, without hatred, with clear and wise understanding. And but we're still in an issue of personal relations here. At the very end of this book, one gets to the small amount of really strictly political issues, which are around what the Buddha called the wheel-turning king, the Dhammika Dhammaraja, who was a king who ruled basically benignly, making sure that the people in his community had enough food to eat, that they were not being preyed upon, that they were safe, and so on. None of these issues are particularly well spelled out. They're in a few texts out of a very, very large variety of texts, which leads some scholars, such as the eminent early Buddhist scholar Richard Gombrich, to say that, and I'll quote him here, "I don't think that the Buddha took a serious interest in politics or intended his teaching to have political consequences." That's perhaps a bit strong. The Buddha certainly would have liked, I think it's clear from the way he spoke, or at least from the text that we have, that he probably would have liked certain things to have happened in larger society. He had no use for the caste system, as we've just said. However, What is clear is that the Buddha was particularly interested in psychology and in how one approached one's own life. And to the extent that the Buddha felt there was a way of impacting politics, it would have been through psychology. And also, he was particularly interested in the monastic community. And again, if he thought there were a way of impacting politics, he probably felt it would have been done through a kind of monastic template. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Buddha started the monastic community because he felt that it was a way of organizing society that was perfectible, or at least, if not perfectible, because that's probably too strong, at least it was a way of making society better by narrowing its scope to a group of like-minded individuals. It was kind of like a retreat society, um, in a way that we've seen many times in the United States and other parts of the world, where people of like mind try to retreat from the larger society and form a group of people who think in a similar way. The Buddha did have discussions, many discussions with kings. There's plenty of evidence for that in the texts. Although exactly how much political philosophy or political ethics or theories of justice he would have discussed with them, that's not clear because we really don't have any evidence or very, very much evidence for that. He was clearly a pacifist. He didn't like warfare. He argued against it. But apart from those kind of general features of his teaching, it's not clear. It's probably worth saying a word at the end about the great Buddhist monarch Ashoka Maurya, who lived from 304 to 232 BCE, or about 100 years. He was born about 100 years after the Buddha died. He was known as the first and perhaps greatest Buddhist monarch. He set up a bunch of edicts inscribed into rock around India, advocating for pacifism, plant medicinal plants around India to protect wildlife, to protect animal life, to allow teachers from different sects, or what we would call now religions, to teach freely, to advocate for donations to them and to advocate for support of people from different religious backgrounds. From a contemporary standpoint, Ashoka had a very enlightened, in a Western European sense, enlightened kind of approach to politics. And we would like to think that that reflects back on the Buddha's, perhaps the Buddha's teachings that he imbibed when he became a Buddhist. How much of that is true, it's difficult to say. There are questions as to how much the Ashoka was really Buddhist, how much he was simply a Buddhist, a lay Buddhist who also believed in other religious ideas or other philosophical ideas at his time. I think if we're going to discuss the Buddhist relation to politics, we have, particularly in its earliest incarnation, we have to look at Ashoka as well. That's a good introduction to Buddhist politics, Buddhism and politics, particularly in its earliest incarnation, if we're looking at the actual material from the Buddha. And I would recommend this book. I would recommend it as a series of a good way of approaching early Buddhist theories of politics and how psychology can impact political and social issues. For those of us who have copies of these texts already, it may seem like, why do we want to have another copy? But I think Bhikkhu Bodhi also includes very interesting introductions to each of the sections. And even if you may have access to these particular texts from Bhikkhu Bodhi or online, just having them in a format where they're easily accessible and easily digestible, and he's cut them down to the sections that are most relevant, I think itself is valuable. So I would recommend the book for anybody who's interested in this kind of topic. So thank you very much. Please put your comments, your questions down below, and any other topics you'd like to see me deal with in the future. Thanks very much.